Oh, that wasn't planned. Wait, let me get mine. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk about identity, and yeah, I want to ask you a couple questions regarding this. What is your first impression of me? Who do you think I am? And what do you think is my identity? This is what interests me. If I had a more polished entrance than compared to what just happened, would you have a different perception of me? Your perception right now influences how you see my entire identity, but it also influences how I structure my narrative right now and how I interact with you as the crowd. Now that I've activated your brains to think a little more about identity and the complexity of it and thinking about who I am, I'd like to explore the definition of identity with you a little further, and we have them beamed up above me. What I found in my research through looking at this definition, I found that there's no one clear definition that scientists are working with, but I've kind of brought them all together in these two definitions. So the first is that it is a socially established category that is established through certain attributes, characteristics, anticipated behaviors, and rules of membership. These categories can define kind of a public perceived identity. And the second is more personal, and these are the features that are socially distinctive, which a person ascribes to. These can be both static or adaptable in nature, but are personal, yet socially consequential. Now, what does this all mean? Features that are socially distinctive and what I mentioned, the socially established categories. Now, I'd like to differentiate the two between how you see me and how I see myself. For the purpose of the conversation, I'm going to look at it as the perceived identity, or how you see me, and personal identity, how I see myself. Daily subliminal inferences based on your past experiences shape how you structure this perceived identity. The beginning of the talk created this kind of awkward interlude. You weren't sure who is this guy, what is happening, and you automatically made certain inferences. Past experiences, your social context, and your upbringing impacted this. Your perceived identity was perhaps similar or diverging according to the people around you. Maybe you still feel kind of awkward about this whole thing, and you infer that I'm a white male, perhaps I'm attracted to people that identify as women. Maybe there's none of that in my life. What is this accent? Where does it fit into your kind of identity boxes? It's kind of strange. Now you're firing up cliches. You bring up thoughts that are triggered by memory or implicit biases. Stories start popping into your mind. Now, globalization has made this even more complex. As we move between nations, we start to see strange combinations of identities, and identities become ever more fluid. My personal identity, perhaps, is a lot more elusive than you think it is, and it's difficult to define by my mere appearance. This causes a weird fissure between what you see of me and what I see of myself. So let me give you a little example. What do you see in this image? The theoretical image that will appear. Thank you. This image is an onion, probably not an ogre as some of you expected, but it is different onions of shapes and sizes and diverse tastes. Now, what if I took another layer off? What would you expect? You'd probably expect more onion. But what if you went a couple layers deeper and suddenly there was an apple? Your idea of an onion would be strange. What is this? It would be rocked, and you'd maybe have to reanalyze how you look at onions. But if I was to come to you a couple days later with a similar onion and ask you, what's beneath these layers? You'd probably still answer an onion. But you'd become more open to the idea that there might just be an apple within. Now, if people have never been exposed to the fact that there might be apples that are disguised as onions, they might never believe you, and they might turn you down and think you're going a little nuts. But my identity feels a lot similar to this analogy. I've always been the outsider. I grew up in a German family, but grew up mostly in South Africa. I was called Hitler in school, and when I moved back to Germany, I was often seen as African that came from afar. My friends would introduce me as not, hey, this is Hauke, my friend, but it'd be, this is Hauke, my African friend. Now, this was very strange, but I began to relish it. I looked at my advantages in this, and I quickly in South Africa became the class clown, earning myself the title of the crazy German. But I did not feel German. I did not feel like South Africa was my home. And even to this day, I feel like I'm an observer of my body, going through these daily motions and structured especially on the appearances and opinions of others. I adapt my identity according to what people perceive of my outer onion layers. I do not feel connected to that, though. Unlike what you think, I feel a lot more like one of these apples stuck in an onion. But through this experience, I've become more aware of the apples, and I've adapted and morphed into the context and into the local identity politics of the situation where I was. I floated in between identities. Now, I became ever more aware of how I was complicit. In my privilege as a white male, I was historically benefiting from the context of this position. And my mere presence in certain international contexts automatically had an impact. My identity was fluid, yet I was static. I was deeply rooted in my individualism and my identity, but because I noticed my role in the broader community, I had to have a reflexive communal identity and nature that in the social space, I was adaptive and understanding. Now, social psychology, as we saw in the previous definitions, identifies identity to be rather adaptable. But I found that public perception of this is far more static. My mere framing of my narrative impacts how you perceive me. I've recently discovered that when I mention that I'm a German that grew up in South Africa, people would go, oh yeah, I can hear the German accent. Where if I said I'm South African and I grew up in a German, I'm originally German, people would say, oh yeah, I can hear the South African accent. So just my mere choice of words impacted how people already identified with me. This is rather anecdotal, but my narrative, it shows how my narrative defined this perceived identity. While I say perceived identity is very static, it shows how it's also rather malleable, and how we need a reflexive nature to react to that and also be accommodating to that. We need to understand our position in the world. So how do we move away from this rather static definition of what we see as identity and perhaps be more open to this new fluidity? You all need to become aware, and all of us need to become more aware of how we shape identity and how we impact how people act around us. We are not autonomous. We influence the communities, and our very nature of speaking influences how communities define themselves. Now, I'm wearing a suit. I'm not wearing my very cherished multicolored onesie, and this is for one reason, that you automatically take me more seriously. Science has shown that people that wear suits are rated as more trustworthy, as more intelligent, and far more serious. So the mere fact that you believe that I am more serious right now wearing a suit perpetuates that I need to wear a suit to seem serious, and perpetuates this almost vicious cycle. So I want to challenge that and say, we need to stop being more ourselves, being more unique, and also being aware of our own identities. But within that, being accommodating and being open to exploring other people's spaces and realities. Become open to this fluidity of the layers of the onions. In my experience, I've been very privileged to travel across very contrasting cultures and multicultural spaces. One cross-cultural communication experience was in Bhutan. There I worked with various international artists, and I noticed how I had to stay reflexive in this situation. Now, what was especially impactful is that they were true to their traditions, and I had a huge respect for that. Their motto was modernization, but not westernization. I entered and I stayed Hauke. Yet, I also had to adapt to the rhetoric to be more accommodating. Western artists that we invited would come in and go, "This is how we're going to do it, and we have this amazing plan, and who's with me?" But no one was really with me, and the doors quickly closed. So when I entered, I realized I had to adapt to that. I did not no longer speak as was normal for a Westerner, but I would walk in and I would try to let the situation guide the conversation. Ways of ideation quickly adapted and became places of joint collaboration where we learned from each other. This learning was deeply rooted in the mistakes that we made in miscommunication, but also in our differences. Superiority was never the goal. In fact, mutual understanding was. And this was quite beautiful to see as it developed. The most successful projects of international artists that I was working with were the ones that came in with humility. They did not say, "This is how we're going to do it," but rather said, "How are we going to do this? What are the options?" Suddenly, friendly conversing developed, and equal sharing became the norm. Social differences were no longer the divider, but they became the glue of the situation. So, why does all this matter? Where do we stand with all this? Knowing who you are as an onion makes you more aware of the flexibility that you experience in elements of your personal identity. You become more open to the identities of others, and you approach diversity in a more reflective and reflexive manner. You become more open to the idea that maybe there are apples inside these onions. As a white male, that's extremely important. You have to be aware of the role as you're conversing across cultures, and you have to be aware of your position. You have to be reflexive, and you have to address your own complicity. But that does not mean you need to be paralyzed to act. Rather, at every step, you should be asking, how do I act in this context? You should become aware of your perceived identity, your own identity, and you should learn to work with your implicit and explicit biases. You need to question the enforced injustices and whether you are enforcing these injustices. But you can also work with the beauty in our differences and in the varying identities that we have in a constructive manner. So while I was working in many different contrasting contexts from South Africa, Germany, India, as mentioned, Bhutan, and now in the US, there were a couple pointers that I found were universal in how I was interacting with others. These were: open up. Secondly, provide space to speak. Be open to providing the space. Be open to your failure in a respectful manner. Be honest and challenge those around you, but also ask and explore yourself to understand your identity, your perceived identity, and, as mentioned, the implicit and explicit biases. You're not the only onion with an intricate, beautiful story. There are onions walking around all over this world with fascinating stories that you can learn from. So relish that, soak it up, see the beauty in that, and enjoy the storytellers around you, because as much as they can teach you, you can also teach those around you in a constructive and respectful way. Thank you.